Also again with me is my great co-host, Christopher. Hey, Chris, good to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
I am totally delighted to introduce my guest today, the renowned composer, oboist, poet, and teacher, Samuel Andreyev. Andreyev studied composition with Alain Gosson in Paris at the Paris Conservatory, where he obtained a master's degree in composition under Frédéric Durieux and a Prix d'analyst under Claude Ledoux. He also studied electroacoustics at IRCAM from 2011 to 2012. His composition Night Division was awarded the Grand Prix of the Concours Dutilleux in 2012. In the same year, he was awarded a one-year residency at the Casa de Velázquez in Madrid. Frequently sought after as a guest lecturer, Samuel teaches privately and in many conservatories and universities across Europe and North America. His music is performed throughout the world by ensembles such as Esprit Orchestra, Nouvelle Ensemble Moderne, Les Percussions de Strasbourg, Hanatsu Mirar, and many others. His most recent book is The Relativistic Empire, was released in October 2015 from Book Thug. His most recent portrait CD, Music with No Edges, was released by Kairos Records Vienna in October 2018. Finally, Samuel runs a popular YouTube channel which contains many great interviews, music analysis, and his music. Samuel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to talk to you.
You are a very, very articulate spokesperson for contemporary music, and just talking only from the education perspective, I love on your YouTube channel how you break down these very complicated works and you go through them very methodically and you really take your time and you really give perhaps even a layperson the chance to really understand some difficult works. I guess I'd like to start off with contemporary music, and I just wanted to ask, are definitions important for you? So for instance, classical, most people associate that with classical music. Would you categorize your music as contemporary music, modern music, classical music? How would you define it?
Well, I would say that categories are useful for the general public just in terms of reducing the chaos of all the different styles that are being practiced today. So, for example, if you're a layperson and you're approaching contemporary music for the first time, it can be actually incredibly helpful to have some categories and labels to stick on things, just so that you're not faced with a sort of a completely chaotic totality of thousands of different styles. The thing with labels and categories, though, obviously, is that they take a lot of the nuance out of things, and they simplify things sometimes to an excessive extent. So I would say that they can be useful just in terms of getting your bearings at first, but as you get to know this music a little bit better, the categories tend to fall away a little bit. They become less important, and you start to be a little bit more aware of the intrinsic qualities of the music that you're actually listening to. I would say that categories, for me personally, are not important at all. And part of the reason for that is that, and I think this is true actually of a lot of composers of my generation, I would say that a lot of us are not terribly concerned with fitting into a particular category. And in fact, some of my colleagues, I would say, make a concerted effort not to fit into a particular category. So that makes us a little bit distinct from earlier generations of composers. For example, the composers born in the 1950s or 1960s were a lot more concerned about positioning themselves aesthetically and technically with regards to what their colleagues were doing. They were much more likely to engage in polemicizing and staking out a particular aesthetic line of inquiry.
Could we give an example of that? So, for instance, one that comes to mind is perhaps Serialism or Minimalism, these two aesthetic definitions. Are those accurate kind of examples?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there are lots of composers that I admire who said very harsh things about music that I like. So, that's typical of that. It's fairly typical of the post-war era generally. I think that there was people felt that there was a lot riding on your aesthetic choices, that it wasn't simply a question of preferring this or that type of music. There was a whole ideological component to it as well, and there was a sense of your overall worldview, I think, coming into the picture. And so someone like Philip Glass, and by the way, I admire the early works of Philip Glass. A lot of contemporary composers turn up their nose at his music, which I think is actually quite unfair. It's not all of the same standard of quality, that's for sure, but there are some very great works. And Philip Glass said some very harsh things. He said that that he found the sort of post-war serial music to be creepy. That was the actual word he used. So yeah, and then on the other side of the fence, you have all kinds of European composers, saying that Philip Glass's music is amateurish, it's badly written, it's overly simplistic, it's too commercial, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, there were definitely a lot of nasty epithets on both sides of the fence.
Now, when we look back in history, people say, of course, Mozart is a genius. He's great. Bach is great. If you look at the 20th century, is there a way to really say that this piece is undeniably great, that piece is undeniably great? Or is it so subjective that it's difficult to really quantify who is great, and it's really case by case?
It's complicated. So I'll give you a concrete example of what I mean. So one of the greatest works of Bach was the St. Matthew Passion, which was premiered in 1729. So this is an extremely lengthy work written in many, many, many different movements. It's considered to be the summit of Bach's achievement as a composer. The work was played maybe a handful of times in Bach's lifetime, and then nothing. It was not played again for literally a century after that, and it wasn't until Felix Mendelssohn, who was a young German musician, who was very interested actually in early music, unlike most of his colleagues. He took it upon himself to stage a performance of the work in 1829, 1 century to the day after its premiere. So you have to, so even someone like Bach, like it seems so obvious today to us that Bach was a great composer, but actually he was not held in particularly high esteem to the extent that he was even known at all by a lot of his successors. So it took a fellow composer, Mendelssohn, to stage one of his greatest works 100 years after it was premiered, with nothing in between. So, and this sort of thing is not a unique historical phenomenon. The same thing happened with Vivaldi. Actually, Vivaldi was subjected to an even longer period of complete historical oblivion. It wasn't really until the first half of the 20th century that Vivaldi's concertos started getting published and performed again.
Amazing.
So yeah, so you have to imagine a lapse of nearly 200 years in that case. So the thing is, the reputation of composers is constantly subjected to reevaluation, and it changes from one generation to the next. It's not a stable thing. It's not as if you enter this pantheon of great composers and you just stay there forever. So sometimes that happens, but very often it doesn't. And the question of evaluating the importance or the greatness of a composer gets harder and harder the closer you are to them in history. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. I mean, one of them is that if I were to look around at the musical landscape of today and try to evaluate, who are the 10 greatest living composers who are working today, it would be incredibly hard for me to make that judgment, partly because I live in that time. I have my own subjective biases. I have my own vision of what I think is important and what I think is less important. And that's obviously going to influence my opinion. And then there's also the simple fact that some works of art, for whatever reason, they age better than others. So there are works that are very important in their time, and they might make a significant contribution to the sort of the aesthetic world of a particular era. But once that initial purpose has been fulfilled, they don't really have all that much left to say to successive generations, and the work is forgotten. That doesn't mean that it would be better that it had never existed, because musical history is a strange thing. Sometimes you need to have a bunch of average pieces in order to result in a really great work. And the thing is, afterwards, the average pieces tend to get forgotten. It doesn't mean that they didn't contribute anything. It just means that they're not the ones that maybe are the most memorable, or the ones that, for whatever reason, still have things to say to successive generations. So it's a complicated question. But as far as the 20th century goes, I think that there are some figures, especially from the first half of the 20th century, where it would be hard to dispute their importance. And part of the way that the importance and the greatness, let's say, of a composer is determined is based on the vision that their colleagues have of them and subsequent composers. Like we often talk about a canon of great Western musical works, and who is it that determines the contents of this pantheon exactly? It's not the audience. This is a common misunderstanding that somehow audiences are polled for their favorite works, and these are the ones that stay in the repertoire, but it's actually not so. The truth is that composers themselves play a very, very large role in terms of what gets preserved, what gets published, what gets talked about, what gets kept in the repertoire. And so, I gave the example of Mendelssohn earlier, who was almost single-handedly responsible for bringing Bach back into concert life. And it's a very similar thing in the 20th century. You have composers like Boulez, for example, regardless of what you might think of his work, who played a very, very major role in creating institutions, creating concert series, making sure that certain musical works were heard and heard regularly. This is not the work of audience members, getting together and saying, this is what we'd like to hear again. There are a handful of extremely influential composers who, through their polemicizing, through their writings, through their critical work, through their work as concert organizers, etc., will say this is I think a work that is worth hearing. And it's kind of this small coterie, I suppose you would say, of influential artists that tend to determine also in terms of what influences their work. So, for example, if a major composer was influenced by Bartók, then that will tend to increase the visibility of Bartók as a major force in the culture. So it's a bit of a complicated question. And I'm not saying, incidentally, that this is necessarily the most desirable state of affairs, but that tends to be how it has functioned historically, up to now at least.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of your beginnings with this? I mean, you're an oboist, and you were in school in Paris, and eventually you're working on your master's with Frédéric Deroux. What was that like coming up? I mean, did you always want to be a composer? Like, how did things change over those years working on your degrees?
Well, I wanted to be a musician since I was 6 years old. So, I mean, you could say that I found my goal in life very, very early on, and I worked steadily towards that. As far as composition, I noticed when I was very young, I mean, when I was 7 or 8 years old, I distinctly remember inventing melodies and singing them and thinking that this was something that everybody did. And it turned out that it wasn't something that everybody did. And I just kept on doing it. And eventually, by the time I was in my teens, this was becoming an all-consuming obsession. I was constantly writing things, or trying to write them anyway, because I didn't always have the ability to write down what I was hearing in my head, at least. But that was something that I wanted to get better at doing. So I started taking composition lessons when I was a teenager, and it just developed from there. And I decided at a certain point that I would probably be better off going to Europe to study composition for all sorts of reasons.
That's a good point. So why did you decide to move to Europe versus other places?
Well, one obvious thing is that I'm bilingual. So I grew up speaking both French and English. I'm a Canadian, and I was put in French immersion when I was quite young, so I'm fluent in both French and English. So the fact of having, it's a banal it's a banal autobiographical fact, but being able to speak another language was instrumental in deciding to go to Europe, and particularly to go to France. So I had a lot of exposure to French culture. My parents took me to Paris when I was 11 years old. My father had a business trip there, and so I was able to see what France was like for a couple of weeks, and that certainly made a big impression on me. And it just struck me that would be a place where I could confront myself with a culture that I had not grown up in, that would maybe have a different perspective, that would enrich my own work as a composer, and also that I would be forced to achieve a very high level of technical ability in order to be able to pursue studies in France, because I wanted to go to the Paris Conservatory, which, in my mind at the time when I was a teenager, was the best place I could possibly go to study composition. That was just the way
it has such an amazing list of famous students. I mean, Debussy and Ravel. When you went there, were you very well versed in composition and music before you even moved? Were you so familiar with all the different types of composers, and were you very advanced yourself, and this was kind of like a finishing school, or is this like almost a midway point of your journey?
Well, again, that's a somewhat complicated question. I would say that I had a very good technical grounding. I had spent many years learning the traditional techniques of composition, and I'd written quite a few works by the time I left. I was 21 years old when I left Canada. 22. Sorry, I was 22. It was in 2003. So by the time I was 22, I'd written quite a lot of different musical compositions in different styles and in different genres. And so I had a certain technical baggage, I suppose you would say, before I left. But I mean, obviously, when you're 22, you have a very primitive and incomplete worldview, and the range of exposure you have to different ideas is necessarily limited. So I didn't, for example, have a very broad understanding of contemporary music when I left Canada. So that was for all sorts of reasons. One thing that it's maybe easy to forget is that in the early 2000s, the internet was still extremely young, and it was, there was no YouTube, and it was extremely difficult to obtain information on contemporary composers, or to obtain recordings, or to even, to attend concerts if you didn't happen to live in a major center where there were a lot of contemporary works being played. And actually, Toronto is a major musical center, but at that time, anyway, the offerings in terms of contemporary music were fairly limited. So it wasn't easy for me when I was in my early 20s to come to terms with this music. For example, if I wanted to study a particular work by Stockhausen, which actually occurred, I wanted to study his piece Gruppen for 3 orchestras. This was a piece that I had read about in a book by Paul Griffiths, which an excellent book that gives you a sort of overview of some of the developments in 20th century music. And I was insanely curious. I wanted to know all about this piece. But to buy the score, it was like, I think it was $200 to buy a copy of the score. I couldn't find it in a library. If you wanted to hear a recording, you had to go to HMV and order the CD, and it would take weeks to get there, et cetera, et cetera. It was a substantial effort and expense involved in trying to gain access to these documents. Whereas today, you go online and you can find almost anything instantly. So it was a little bit different then.
Samuel, one thing I want to ask you is, when you get gripped by this intense fascination with a composer, do you also dive into their biographies and their letters and to get a sense of the person himself, or is that not important?
No, it's very important for me. I've always spent actually a lot of time reading biographies and reading histories of music because I find it extremely interesting to understand how composers lived, how it is that they came to write their works, what it was they were trying to do, how they were viewed by their colleagues, etc. It gives you a sense of historical perspective that I think is incredibly valuable for a composer, because for one thing, it gives you courage. Because when you look into the lives of musicians such as Edgar Varèse or Webern, there's so many different figures who just had horrible, catastrophic lives, like just one disaster after another. And yet somehow they managed to not only survive, but also to persist in creating music, that comes out of an extremely personal and idiosyncratic vision. And it's easy to just, buy the CD and listen to the piece in a concert and think, oh, it's great that somebody wrote this. But you have to, sometimes it's really instructive to have a sense of what exactly they had to go through, what they had to endure in order to even complete the work in the first place. And very often in a context of not only indifference, but actually outright hostility to what they were trying to accomplish. So when you understand what was involved in making some of these works and how extraordinarily difficult the conditions were for composers, especially, for example, in the first half of the 20th century, then you realize how comparatively well off you are today, because a lot of young musicians don't have to deal with that sort of thing. I'm not saying it's an easy path, because it certainly is not. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to make a living as a composer, and it's very, very difficult to build an audience and to find a path forward. But at least you don't have to deal with world wars. You don't have to deal with the threat of starvation. Probably, if you're in a Western country, it's unlikely that you're going to have to deal with those things directly. Whereas in the 1930s, you have to think about what it was like living in Europe at the time, and trying to advance this sort of very radical vision of what music could be, despite intense political oppression at times, incredible economic hardship, and just a constant threat of chaos. So, yes, it's very valuable to have an awareness of those things.
So one thing that you just mentioned too was sort of this radical vision of music, and one of the first compositions of yours after moving to Paris was the Locus Solace, a solo piece for oboe.
Yeah.
You showed the piece to Bedrosian, who felt that the instrumental writing wasn't sufficiently invested in radical playing techniques, and suggested you listen to like Lachman and Grissy. What did he mean by radical playing?
Well, there is a whole stream of composers, I would say starting in the 1960s particularly, that were extremely invested in innovative performance techniques. So in other words, ways of playing instruments that aren't usually covered in the standard conservatory training. So a lot of these techniques were developed through improvisation. They were developed through experimentation. So like, for example, if you take a cello, there's all sorts of sounds that you can produce on a cello that aren't conventional cello sounds, depending on how you play the instrument. For example, you can play with excess bow pressure on the strings and move the bow closer to the bridge, so you get a kind of excess pressure. It's a very scratchy, noisy sort of sound. Or you can produce white noise by bowing on the bridge directly while muting the strings. There's a whole range of different types of pizzicato that you can produce, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a whole circle of composers, and I would say the spearhead of that group was Helmut Lachenmann, a German composer, who developed what he called music-concrète instrumentale, so instrumental music-concrète. And what that basically means is that you're radically expanding the world of possible sonorities that you can produce on classical instruments, so that a cello doesn't necessarily have to sound like a cello. It can sound like, it could even serve as a kind of percussion instrument. So that was a musical stream, I suppose you could say, that was very influential in France, in Western Europe generally, at the time that I was beginning to study composition there. I would say that influence is still fairly strong, although I think it's weaned somewhat since then. Now composers seem to be, especially very young composers, are moving towards musical theater, improvisation, sort of multimedia works, things involving screens and videos and that sort of thing. So, but anyway, at the time there was this intense fascination for expanding the vocabulary of instrumental techniques and for producing works whose explicit subject, I think, was sound, the sort of material qualities of sound, and seeing how far you can go in that direction.
Would you call it unconventional, or is that something that wouldn't be in your vocabulary if you're more contemporary? Like, I mean, technically, if I was teaching a cello to somebody, I wouldn't necessarily first go to some of these different, unique ways to produce sound, like let's say percussion. So I guess is that something that's not really in the contemporary composer's vocabulary, is sort of unconventional use of the instrument?
It depends on your circle, and it depends on your perspective. So, if you're coming out of the sort of, there's a very famous international music course that happens every 2 years in the German town of Darmstadt. And Darmstadt has existed since, I can't remember the year it started, maybe 1945 or 46. Anyway, it's a very well-known international summer school for avant-garde composers. And if you're in that sort of a circle, if you're part of the circle of composers that sort of goes to these different festivals that are happening around Europe, then it would be an extremely conventional thing to do, because there are, vast numbers of young composers who are sort of somewhat unthinkingly aping the predominant styles, whatever they may be, and practicing them with, a more or less great degree of understanding. And so, yeah, I mean, there are hundreds, probably thousands actually, of young composers writing extremely similar pieces that come out of that vein. So on the one hand, you could say, for a young composer active in Europe writing that sort of music, it's actually very conventional to do that. But if you were to shift your perspective and say, look at what might be happening at a music school in the Midwest in the United States, you might find a lot less of that sort of thing. And then if your perspective is sort of the average concert goer who's mainly familiar with with classical music or with opera, then that would certainly sound extremely unfamiliar to them. So it's really a question of perspective, which brings me to one other point, which I'll briefly touch upon, which is that until relatively recently in the history of music, there was such a thing as the audience, in quotation marks. There was such a thing as a sort of coherent, homogeneous, mostly middle-class audience for classical music that was relatively cohesive. In other words, you could go to any major European capital city, and you'd probably see approximately the same sorts of repertoire being played, and probably those audiences would not have any particular difficulty in determining what they wanted to hear and where they would go to hear it. Nowadays, that situation has really fragmented. So you no longer have a sort of cohesive middle-class audience that consumes classical concerts and operas and things like that. What you have now is an incredibly splintered audience made up of specialists who tend to be interested in very niche-like streams of music. So you might have the audience member that is mainly interested in jazz, or somebody whose passion is opera. You might have somebody who only listens to contemporary music and has very little knowledge of classical music. You have people who are interested in improvisation. And you'll see that there are a lot of audience members who have really specialized listening habits. And that's not to say that there aren't people who also have a broad range of things that they listen to, because there's also people like that. But the point is just that you can't really speak of the audience anymore. You have to speak of multiple audiences. And I think that that's one major difference between today and the way music was practiced, say, 100 years ago.
Do you think that it's a bit like, I guess, what would the word be, geographical, like certain places are going to have, as you mentioned, these different pools of audiences? I would almost think that nowadays we'd have people that are sort of more open-minded because music is more accessible. I know my first experience with using instruments in an unconventional way was actually like Frank Zappa. It wasn't Philip Glass or someone that you might think as a contemporary composer that would come up right away. But I found that through rock, and I went from other places from there. So do you think that people are going to be limited by their geography, what they're going to be here? Do you think that YouTube is going to create a wider range for listeners and an interest in the audience?
Well, YouTube has definitely had that effect. I mean, I think people only have the dimmest awareness of the radical change that YouTube implies in terms of listening habits and the way people consume music generally. It's partly a question of what is available to you. So I spoke about the sort of average bourgeois concert goer in the late 19th century, for example, and the fact that in all likelihood they would be interested in the same operas, the same symphonies, and et cetera. Whereas that's really not the case anymore. So one analogy I can give you is that I was recently in Buffalo, New York, and I wanted to buy some toothpaste. So I go into a supermarket, and there's like 300 kinds of toothpaste. It's insane. And then it's like, what the hell do you choose? You have no idea. And you're standing there in front of this seemingly limitless expanse of micro variations of the different types of toothpaste you could buy. And you feel slightly insane. It's like it's kind of a crazy situation. But then the thing is, when you're used to that, when it becomes normal to have 300 types of toothpaste to choose from, then it starts to matter. You start to think, oh, I actually really need this particular type, because if I don't, then my toothbrushing experience will not be optimal. And then it's kind of an analogy, I think, to what's happening in YouTube, where I spoke about this sort of hyper specialization of people's tastes, where they have really, really specific things they're interested in, and I think that has a positive aspect to it. But it also has the somewhat negative aspect that it can be paradoxically harder to get people interested in listening to a wide range of things. So it's this weird situation where, for the first time in human history, everything that has ever been written in music practically is available at your fingertips. Like if you pay $10 a month for a Spotify membership, you can listen to anything. It's like anything that's ever been recorded and released practically is on Spotify. It's insane, and I don't think we really comprehend what an incredible change that is. It wasn't the case 15 years ago, not even remotely.
You mentioned the word improvisation, classical improvisation. I mean, that's a topic that I'm very interested in, considering how it used to be so prevalent in the 18th century, but seems to be completely dead now. What's your take on improvisation in music?
Well, I think one of the things that's happening right now is that, in the post-war period, composers were writing scores that were incredibly detailed and incredibly specific. So, and probably one of the most extreme examples of that is the so-called New Complexity school of composers that were mostly born in the 1940s and 1950s. And these were composers writing insanely detailed scores and incredibly complicated music. I think it's actually a very interesting historical development. I'm very interested in these composers, but I think there was also somewhat of a reaction to composers writing such specific notation where every single detail, every tiny, minute nuance, every detail of tone color and articulation and dynamics was minutely specified by the composer. So on the one hand, this allowed composers to be incredibly specific about what they wanted to hear, but at the same time, there was certainly a reaction among a lot of performers that this sort of puts them in a straitjacket because, it leaves, well, to a certain type a performer, it can appear to leave them in a straitjacket where they have a lot less room to sort of interpret the work, so to speak. And I think some composers felt this way as well, that they didn't want to be so hyper-specific in their notation. And so I think the fascination that you're seeing with a lot of younger composers with improvisation is partly a result of just this desire to have a more symbiotic relationship with performers and to have more of a sense of openness and collaboration and just of the excitement of seeing what can happen spontaneously as opposed to minutely planning everything in advance. But when I speak of improvisation with regards to contemporary composition, I mean it's a very, very wide field, so that can take all sorts of different forms. And obviously jazz has its own improvisational tradition, which is also a very distinct thing.
Could you talk about your piece, PHP for Heckelphone and Two Pianos from 2003, that you had to wait 8 years to hear a performance? You mentioned it was a truly utopian project. What do you mean by that?
Well, when I was starting out, especially after I moved to France, I had very specific ideas of what I wanted to do and what sort of pieces I wanted to write. And it didn't matter to me all that much whether those pieces could in fact be performed immediately or not. My sense was that I had a vision of something, and I was determined to put that vision down on paper, and then to try to find a practical solution later so that the pieces could actually be heard and performed. So that's doing things a little bit backwards, because typically young composers will tend to orient their production towards the pragmatic opportunities that they have in front of them. So for example, if you have a performer friend who plays the tuba, then the pragmatic approach would be to say, okay, I'll write some tuba music because I know my friend will play it. But that wasn't the approach I took. It was really, okay, I'm super interested in this weird instrument, the Heckelphone, and I want to do a piece with Heckelphone and two pianos because that way I can explore these spatial effects between two pianos playing off of each other, and I'll put the Heckelphone in the middle. And that was a very specific vision for a piece that I had. It didn't matter to me that there was absolutely no chance in hell that that piece would ever get played. So I just wrote it, and then afterwards I tried to find a solution so that it would be performed. So as it turns out, it took a very long time for that to happen. Now, it isn't as though I was inactive during that time, because the corollary to that is that I think it's also very important for young composers to hear their works be played, because it's actually very difficult to advance technically as a composer if you don't have the experience of sitting in a concert hall watching your piece being performed. I mean, that's an incredibly important thing. So I did have pieces that were performed during that time. I want to make that clear. But there were also some works that, for logistical reasons, for practical reasons, were just very, very difficult to present publicly, and that was one of them. But the main thing for me was writing it down. And then when I eventually did have a chance to have the piece performed, and performed very, very well, it was a very important experience for me, because as far as I'm concerned, in order for a piece to truly be finished, it's not enough just to write the score. For a piece to be finished nowadays, I think means that it has to be written, published, recorded, and performed multiple times. Otherwise, the piece isn't finished. Otherwise, it doesn't really properly exist in the world. So I've spent a lot of time, a lot of energy ensuring that all of my pieces, at least the ones that I want to keep, the ones that I'm satisfied with on some level, are recorded commercially, so that they're commercially available on CDs or whatever, that the scores are published and available so you can buy the scores, and also that they're performed, at least on a semi-regular basis so that audience members have a chance to actually hear them live. And that actually takes a lot of work. It's much easier to just write one piece after the other and have a premiere, and then maybe the piece is forgotten after that. But it's very, very difficult to write pieces that can sort of enter some form of a repertoire and be played multiple times. And that's always been my focus.
Now, you withdrew a piece of music called Signal, which you worked on for an entire year. And not only that, you said approximately half of the pieces that I wrote between 2003 and 2012 were eventually discarded. And you said, I can see no reason to publish work which falls short of my standards, regardless of how long I may spend writing a piece. That's really strict on yourself. Would you deem yourself a perfectionist? And what does that term mean to you?
Well, perfectionism to me means that you have, first of all, you have a rigorous critical sense. So you're always thinking about whether something is as good as you can make it or not. I think that's a very important distinction, because if I write a piece of music and I know that on some level it could be better, that haunts me. I can't go to sleep at night. Like that's something that really that I really have to think about. And then the question becomes, okay, is it possible for me to make this piece better? Or is the fundamental conception of the piece, or is the material of the piece in some manner intrinsically flawed or insufficient so that I can't rehabilitate it and it would be better off if I just withdrew it? And in that case, I have absolutely no hesitation about withdrawing or destroying works. So, and part of my reason for that is that I'm aware of the fact that there's a gigantic flood of musical creation happening all the time. And there are lots of composers that are writing, 10 pieces a year, 15 pieces a year, that are just constantly producing new work. And, the vast majority of this work, realistically speaking, has an extremely restricted audience and will have a very short shelf life. And it just seems to me, based also on my reading of history and my understanding of a lot of the major composers of the 20th century, that it's probably more optimal to produce possibly a smaller quantity of works, but to make sure that each work is in some manner significant, so that it presents some new aspect of the composer's musical thought, or that it does something that the other pieces don't do, or that on some level it really satisfies the purpose or the project of the piece, whatever that may be. If I think that a work falls short of that, or let's say it's an okay piece, but it's not a great piece, then I just can't think of any reason to keep it, because there are lots of great pieces that exist, and why would I want to add a sort of average piece or a piece that doesn't quite work to this mountain of scores that already exist and that don't get played very often? So what I'm really trying to do, I suppose, is just ensure that through the absolute maximizing of whatever ability I may have, I'm trying to make the work as strong as I possibly can.
So is this, for you, like composing, I guess contemporary music specifically, is it easy for you, or is this very taxing, intense? I know way back when I was in a composition class, I was asked to do something that was more contemporary, and it wasn't a language that I knew enough of, I suppose. Would you just say that, okay, I've been doing this for a long time, so I know the language, so it comes to me faster? I would have a hard time knowing where to start. Would you say it's easy, or is this something that does still take, it can take a year, obviously, but is this a language that you just know well enough where you kind of know where to go immediately, or is this still a difficult task to do something that's less, I guess, conventional, like your early studies of composition?
Well, I feel like I'm working blindfolded with a broken chisel with my hands tied behind my back in the dark.
So I guess it's
yeah, and I'm standing knee deep in oil.
Oh, I guess that answers that question.
and the oil gets higher and higher every year, and the chisel gets a little bit more broken every year, and yeah, no, it's rough. It's real rough. It never gets easy. It gets harder every year. And I think partly that's because as you get a little bit older and you have more experience and you have more works behind you, you have a more acute awareness of the weight that individual decisions have during the creative process. At least that's been my experience of it. Now, that being said, I would say that there are composers who have maybe more facility, or who, let's say, they stake out a very particular aesthetic ground, and they develop a set of techniques that allows them to produce works quickly and in keeping with a particular situation. So, for example, if someone comes up to them and says, I need a piece for string quartet and I need it in 3 months, then that composer can take the technique and the range of approaches that they developed in their work and sort of hammer out a piece that's competent in not very much time. There are lots of examples of composers like that throughout history. Paul Hindemith is one of them, incidentally, and that's not knocking Hindemith, incidentally. That is not a trivial skill to have, to be able to do that. But that's just not been the way that my own work has gone, because I suppose the thing that interests me the most is, can I surprise myself? Can I do something that I haven't done before? Can I do something in my work that I would not have expected when I started out? And if the answer to that is yes, if I'm just sort of producing a minor variation on something that I've already done, then that for me is not going to sustain my interest for very long. Because what I really am fascinated by is reaching down into the depths, so to speak, and finding these strange animals that exist somewhere in the vast universe of potential, but that don't exist as concrete manifested works of art yet. And that's just the way I approach things. So I'm not so interested in the more artisanal side, I suppose you would say, where you develop a range of techniques and then you apply them, in a more pragmatic way to each different situation, so that you can sort of produce works made to order rather quickly.
Would you say that like this? And you can, I don't mean to put you in a box here, but like, do you feel like that constant pursuit of newness or just creating these sort of like fresh new pieces that sort of strive to make everything, I guess, innovative, tiresome? Is there anything wrong with having a particular voice, or do you find it to be exhausting to constantly try to write stuff that's like innovative and nothing like what you've done before? And if so, what does that look like? What is that process like when you're trying to do that?
Well, it's not exactly exhausting, because if it were exhausting, then I would have a very short career, because I'd be too worn out from the constant struggle to actually produce anything. So it's tiring, yes, but it isn't only tiring. It's also exhilarating. It's also an ecstatic experience, because it's like you're constantly pushing yourself to the brink, to the very edge of what you can do. And you're constantly deliberately putting yourself in a situation where failure is a very real prospect, where the piece really could not turn out well, and you could have an embarrassing public spectacle on your hands when the piece is premiered. That's something that could happen, and there's no guarantee against that. And you're putting yourself voluntarily in that situation again and again and again. But it actually makes you stronger, and it makes you, I think, more confident in a certain sense. Once you have a few pieces that you can say, okay, that piece took me somewhere new, and I think it's successful in what it tried to do. So yeah, for me, it's the only possible approach, because I would just be bored to death if I knew in advance what the outcome of a particular project was going to be. If I could just say, okay, here's a vision for a piece that comes to me in a flash, and now all I have to do is sit down and write it out, then I wouldn't be engaged in the process. But frankly, I think that anything in life that's meaningful and worthwhile is probably going to be difficult. Maybe that's just my worldview, but it's certainly been my experience that the things that I've found the most fulfilling and the most meaningful and important have been things that have generally been very, very difficult to do. And maybe the sense of effort and the sense of having to break through a personal limitation in order to achieve something is just a sensation that I'm addicted to. I don't know. But I would be disgusted with myself if I were to just sit down with a few things that I already know how to do and just keep doing them over and over again.
Now, if anyone were to look at one of your scores, they might feel incredibly intimidated. It looks very difficult. Is music notation able to match the demands of contemporary music in the 21st century?
Well, notation is a real problem for contemporary composers, because it actually affects things more than we think. So, you have to think actually very carefully about a bunch of things. So first of all, I think it's useful to try to imagine the music in your head before you write it down in as much detail as possible. And so you have to be able to conceive of what I would call a sound image before you actually start putting pen to paper. And then you have to think about, okay, what is the optimal way for me to try to communicate this sound image to a performer? And that's where notation comes in, because notation is the intermediary. It's the go-between between your personal vision and the actual manifestation of that vision in the real world. So if you choose a notation that is either overly detailed or not detailed enough, or that isn't properly thought through, then the performer is going to have a very hard time understanding what it is that you want and entering into some kind of a sympathetic resonance with what you're trying to achieve. So it's an incredibly important question. I would say, though, that throughout the 20th century, a very wide range of notational practices have been developed, and all sorts of things have been tried. Some of them have worked very well. Some of them have not been working very well and have been abandoned. And so I think it's certainly possible to achieve an adequate musical notation that gives a clear idea of what you want as a composer. Some of the greatest composers of the 19th and 20th centuries have had a very idiosyncratic and specific approach to notation that has set them apart from their colleagues. Like Stravinsky is a very good example of that. His scores are impeccably notated. They're perfect in that sense. He knew exactly what he wanted to hear, and he had a very clear way of writing it down. Gustav Mahler is another one who wrote uncommonly detailed scores for the time. So I think that musical innovation, generally speaking, implies some form of notational innovation, or at least a notation that is detailed and specific enough to communicate what it is that you want.
Now, you place newness as a valuable attribute when attached to a piece of work. But just to be clear, I'm not talking purely about newness in the chronological sense, but more to a certain indelible freshness to a piece. And you talked about this earlier. How do you capture that freshness to something, to a piece of music?
Well, I think that newness is a synonym for authenticity. I think that the two concepts are intrinsically linked. So my sense is that if you follow your musical intuition with proper devotion and care, and you go where it leads you, and you don't get distracted by things that are, secondary or auxiliary concerns, then you have a much higher likelihood of writing something that's new. So when I say authenticity, what I mean is, for example, if you're a young composer starting out, there are lots of temptations on the sort of career path that you're going to be facing. So one of them might be, for example, okay, currently the festivals seem to be programming a certain type of piece quite a lot. So let's say that there's a particular musical style that is currently fashionable. So you could say, okay, well, I'm going to try my hand at that style because, pragmatically speaking, I have a higher likelihood, currently at least, of getting programmed in these festivals according to that particular style. So maybe that style really coincide exactly with your own sensibility, with your own understanding, your own values, your own sense of what's important in music. But you do it anyway because, maybe that will create some opportunities for you in the short term. And that does tend to work in the short term. But I think it's a terrible long-term strategy because it means that if you're going to have a catalog of works that were written in order to satisfy a very short-term need, but that don't necessarily, because the thing about writing something new or writing something authentic is that it actually requires some degree of sacrifice. It requires you to think very, very, very carefully about what you want to do and why and how you're going to do it. And that might mean doing so, in a way that goes against the current of what everybody else is doing. And that's an incredibly hard thing to do. It's much easier to be carried along with the flow of what people are doing. And it's very, very hard to pursue a solitary vision because there's going to be no shortage of people criticizing it, not being interested in it, not wanting to perform your work, etc. So it takes a certain strength of character, I think, to pursue a particular idiosyncratic vision.
Many people were able to be introduced to you and your work through your conversation with the popular psychologist Jordan Peterson, who's repeatedly invited his fans to check out your work. What's your relationship? Is this something that all Canadians know each other? Or
Well, in Canada, the population of Canada is in what is it, about 35 million or something? I think it's like 1/10 of the population of the United States, so it's a small country comparatively speaking. The population of Canada is half of that of France. So it's a strange place because geographically it's this, I think, the second largest country in the world after Russia, but then the population is actually quite sparse. So no, not all Canadians know each other. I mean, Toronto is a city of 2.7 million people. Maybe I could have that number slightly wrong, but I think that's right. But I am from Toronto, and he's from Toronto, and we knew some people in common. And this, by the way, goes back quite a ways. So I knew him many years before he became famous, and that, incidentally, has been a very interesting phenomenon to observe. Just it's not often that sort of thing happens. In fact, I don't know if what has happened to him has actually ever happened to anyone, really, in terms of so rapidly becoming a major cultural force,
especially an academic.
Yeah, especially for a psychology professor who wasn't known to the public particularly up to that point, for that to happen, literally overnight. I think it happened in the space of a few weeks, actually. Is really a unique phenomenon, and to observe that happening also to someone that is extremely interesting. It's not often that happens.
Okay, now we're going to end off with the hot seat question time. Now, these are in the name of fun, so just try your best to answer them. They might be ridiculous, but it's all in fun. So, name your top 3 contemporary composers, alive or dead, 20th century, 21st century.
Oh, okay. Well, that's unbelievably difficult to answer because here's why. Because I listen to many, many, many things all the time, and my favorite pieces tend to be the ones that I'm currently listening to. So it's not always that stable. But I mean, in terms of the musicians that have had a lasting impact on me, I'm certainly fascinated by Anton Webern and his life and work. I mean, that's been an enduring fascination of mine since I was a teenager, and it's still the case today. So Webern is certainly one of them. I'm very, very intrigued by the work of the English composer Brian Ferneyhough, who I've been following for a long time in all of his different stylistic developments. So he's a composer who's associated with the label of new complexity that I mentioned earlier. So that's certainly a major figure. And then Morton Feldman is another one. So Morton Feldman was an American composer who is probably most famous for his late scores for the last 10 or so years of his production, where he was writing these very, very lengthy pieces that often contain only a very small number of notes. I mean, that's a very simplistic description of his achievement, because I think he was a very great musician. But so those are three, radically different composers that have all had a lasting interest for me. And but there's a very, very long list. I mean, there's all sorts of musicians whose work I listen to. Someone whose work really affected me a lot when I was a student, and who I still follow and enjoy, is Rebecca Saunders. That's a British composer whose work goes extremely far in terms of exploring different types of sonority and different instrumental techniques. And she's someone who sort of comes out a little bit of that perspective that I talked about earlier, with the search for new instrumental sonorities, and really developing that in very, very interesting directions.
Here's a fun one for you. 3 favorite instruments to compose with. If you could you're on a desert island, 3 instruments to compose for, rather, what would they be?
Okay, I would say bass flute, let's say vibraphone, guitar.
Oh, that sounds like a jazz trio.
And number 4. I'm trying to think about which instruments would go together and would provide a lot of, let's say double bass.
All right, now name your top 3 more classical composers of the more traditional tonal tradition, like Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, that type.
Well, Bach is number 1 for sure, without hesitation. For me, he's absolutely central. I would also say Schubert was very, very important to me, and probably let's see. Yeah, these are such difficult questions. Very, very hard to answer. And probably Mozart. Yeah. That would be my spontaneous list. Yeah.
So here's the last one. Name 3 works of yours that you would recommend to a brand new listener of yours.
Well, I think they should start with my most recent pieces. So that would be Strasbourg Quartet. And there's a very beautiful recording of that actually just came out on CD a few weeks ago. So there's an Austrian label called Kairos, Kairos, Kairos Records, that just put out my new CD, which is called Music with No Edges. And that's a CD that was produced with a wonderful contemporary music ensemble in Strasbourg called Anats du Miroir. So just go to the Kairos Records website, and I think they've still got it featured as the sort of masthead on the website. So the CD is called Music with No Edges. And so Strasbourg Quartet, which is a 25-minute chamber piece for flute, clarinet, cello, and percussion. And I'm pleased with that piece because I think it has I hope it has at least a wide range of different colors and textures, and also an emphasis on rhythms, especially pulsed rhythms. So I think that for someone who's coming to my music for the first time, maybe the rhythmic aspect in that piece would make it a little bit easier for them to enter into my particular sound world.
So that's the beginner listener. But what about someone who's familiar? What's the most challenging piece that you really want to test the ears of a discerning listener?
Well, the piece that people probably tend to like the least is probably Moving, a piece called Moving that I wrote in 2005 or 6. And that's for piccolo, oboe, viola, and and piano, and that's like piccolo oboe, like not piccolo and oboe, but like the small oboe. So yeah, that's a peculiar piece. It's just to say the least. And it hasn't had a great deal of success in terms of in performances. I think it's only been played once. And we did actually make a recording of it for Radio France. That's on my first portrait CD, and I think it's actually a very good recording because the piece is just insanely difficult to play. It's insane, and it's been very hard to get repeat performances simply because the score is so unbelievably challenging. Plus, there's the instrumental difficulty. You have to be able to find a piccolo oboe. They're not very common instruments, and they're very hard to play. So you have multiple levels of difficulty in that piece. And also it's kind of it's really, really super spiky. It's a complicated piece, and it's got a lot of dissonant sonorities. And I think for someone coming to my music for the first time, they might find that one a little bit challenging.
Well, it's been such a pleasure to have the great Samuel Andreyev here to talk music with us, and I think I've really learned a lot. And so, Samuel, do you have any project you'd like to mention just before we end off?
Well, I suppose the main thing right now is I haven't been able to devote as much attention to my YouTube channel as I would like over the past 7 months. And that's mainly because I had a daughter in May, and then I've been traveling a lot.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, so I've been preoccupied with that, and that's been a wonderful experience, but it does leave you with less time. And then the other thing is I had a very extended period of travel that just went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, just due to a bunch of projects coming one after the other. So so I haven't been able to produce analysis videos as regularly as I would like over that period. However, I'm back at home now, and things are a little bit more settled, and I'm going to be working intensively on the channel. I have a lot of ideas for new videos that I'm currently working on, and I'm going to be trying to release them on a more regular basis. So over the next few months, viewers can expect to see a lot more content being released on my YouTube channel. And I'm also working hard to acquire video recordings and audio recordings of some of my more recent pieces to put those on YouTube as well. Because a lot of the things that you can easily hear of mine on the internet are older pieces, ones that have been performed a bunch of times and recorded. But the more recent works are not necessarily available yet, just simply because it can take a while for the rights to clear and to get suitable quality videos and so on to put those online. But I've been working hard on that, and so I hope that my more recent compositions will be posted online very shortly.
Well, it's been such a pleasure, Samuel. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. The great Samuel Andreyev, thank you so much again, Samuel. Have a great, great day.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. Great to talk to you.